Now the crisis, when it happens, is in fact the result of human activities. But Weber doesn't go much farther than that in terms of diagnosing the internal workings of this system. He recognizes that it's a radical new system and that it's remarkable in its ability to produce things and organize people, but he doesn't attempt to analyze it internally much more than that. And that's where it's going to be helpful for us to think about Marx. Just a couple of quick illustrations. This is one that I don't think I quite had time to flesh out for you in the last lecture. Here are some depictions of sugar plantations, sugar production on plantations. I discussed the idea that the factories or the processing facilities on these plantations were sort of early examples of industrialism that originated not in the United Kingdom, but in the colonies. I showed you these graphs depicting the radical increase in sugar consumption in the United Kingdom over time as these plantations became larger and larger and more widespread, and sugar became a cheaper and more ubiquitous part of the British diet, suggesting that this was unevenly distributed between the wealthy and the poor, and also pointing out the way in which it was highly sensitive to various kinds of external perturbations such as wars. Now, this graph was also, I believe, in one of the earlier lectures, but I didn't have time to discuss it at any length. This shows prices and the change in stocks, which is to say stockpiles, of sugar in the world market. And the point here being that you get this sort of lag effect between a spike in prices, which induces investors to increase capacity. Right? If prices go way up and you're a sugar producer, that gives you a reason to plant more sugar. But you can't harvest that sugar right away. There's going to be a period of time that passes in which those new sugarcane plants have to get established and grow. It's several years before you'll actually have a crop. And so it takes a little while for production to increase and create this spike in the stock, the supply of sugar. And of course, processed sugar doesn't go bad, right? Unless it gets damaged in some fashion. So you can, in fact, stockpile it. And what happens is that if there's a big glut of supply, prices will collapse. And you will see a decline in the world supply until prices inch back up again and induce people to produce more. So this is an example of rational speculation in Weber's framework, right? And it's a current phenomenon. It happens right here in our world right now with all kinds of commodities, particularly agricultural commodities, but also other commodities that likewise require a period of time between the decision to invest in production and the actual production coming online on the market. Are there any questions about any of that? So now let's think about coffee in more detail. These are words from the website of the International Coffee Organization, which I found interesting because it provides some interesting background, historical background, with which to think about the movie Black Gold. It says coffee is a tree crop which became an important commodity in international trade during the 19th century. Since then, it has suffered from long periods of oversupply and low prices, followed by relatively brief periods of short supply and high prices. So the same exact dynamic that we were talking about a moment ago with respect to sugar. In more recent times, during the period of severe economic depression in the 1930s and during the Second World War from 1939 to 45, supply increased, demand fell, and prices were low. In the immediate post-war years, however, demand increased and supplies were inadequate to satisfy this rising demand. Between 1950 and 53, stocks reached levels below the minimum needs for normal trading purposes, a situation which was exacerbated by the outbreak of the Korean War and a serious drought in Brazil, which was followed by a frost. So in the immediate post-war period, you see this dynamic playing itself out on the global scale in such a fashion as to bring normal trading to a standstill. There was simply not enough coffee. Prices rose to unprecedented heights in 1953. This gave rise to a substantial increase in planting throughout the world, and overproduction followed. Stocks increased, and in the second half of the 1950s and early 1960s, prices fell drastically. This led to an intergovernmental initiative to attempt to stabilize the market and to halt the fall in prices, which had had serious economic and political consequences for a large number of coffee-producing countries in Latin America and Africa. So you can imagine this swing back and forth, particularly pronounced in third world countries, in which very high prices for coffee induce large-scale investments in production, followed by the discovery that prices have fallen off the table, and you can't, in fact, make money harvesting these crops. And this can create economic and political consequences. This was the Cold War. You don't want lots of people in poor countries getting restive if you're the United States in the Cold War, because you worry that this will, in fact, be taken advantage of by socialist or communist interests, right? So what you see for much of the sort of middle to late period of the 20th century was an effort to contend with this through international agreements. Governments and coffee producers coming together and trying to formulate a framework that would moderate these swings, these extreme boom and bust swings. So they implemented a series of international coffee agreements after 1962. The agreements reached in 76 and 83 imposed export quotas in order to stabilize prices. It said, okay, we're going to allocate quotas to different countries of the world. We're going to say this is how much you are allowed to export. And obviously, coffee, because it's grown mostly in the tropics and consumed mostly outside the tropics, it's very much about international trade, right? So if you can allocate certain amounts to the different countries that produce coffee and say you're only allowed to export this amount, that will necessarily dampen the amount of investment that is made in that country into production of coffee and prevent them from over-investing, because beyond some point, they can't export it anyway. These quotas were designed to be lifted, suspended automatically if prices got too high. If the international price of coffee rose too far, then the quotas were suspended and every country was allowed to essentially export more to try to bring prices down by increasing supply in international markets. If prices then fell, the quotas would be reimposed. So what you have is a political agreement that is intended to minimize the swings, the sort of overshoot between production and demand, and stabilize prices so that people growing coffee don't find themselves making no money at all. Now, the quotas were suspended in 1989 at a period of high prices, and there has been a failure ever since then to reach a new coffee agreement. Any idea why? Why might this be different in 1989 or after 1989 than before? The fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War. There was no longer a sort of galvanizing, overarching need or perception of a need in the West, specifically the United States, to maintain this system whose purpose was to essentially stabilize coffee prices for people in third world countries. And you can read more about this on the website if you want to get into all the nitty-gritty details about the negotiations and the inability of this international framework to be revived and reimposed. But this is the context in which you should look at black gold and understand what's going on. This is what creates the larger conditions in which those coffee producers are attempting to make a living. And it's a nice illustration of Weber's arguments about speculation. So that brings us to these questions. Probably about time for a short break. Yeah, let's break for 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and talk about Marx. Okay. So let's talk about Marx. A little background. He was born and educated in Germany. He earned a PhD in philosophy. His dissertation was about actually ancient Greek philosophers. He was briefly a journalist, and he continued for the rest of his life to write for popular audiences. You may not have felt this way when you were reading that selection from Capital, but he actually intended it to be entirely comprehensible to non-academics, non-scholars. He wanted it to be comprehensible to the working class. He was persecuted first in Germany, which caused him to move to Paris. He was persecuted in Paris, so he moved to Brussels. He was persecuted in Brussels, so he moved to London. He spent the rest of his life in London. He was attempting in his writings to synthesize philosophy and political economy. Comprising, well, both what we think of as economics and what we think of today as political science, and actually more than just the sum of those two. He starts his analysis in Capital. He suggests that the place to look to understand capitalism is the commodity. We're going to talk about the commodity. The circulation of commodities is the starting point of capital. The production of commodities and their circulation in its developed form, namely trade, form the historic presuppositions under which capital arises. World trade and the world market date from the 16th century, and from then on the modern history of capital starts to unfold. This isn't to say that he would dispute Weber's contention that industrial capitalism dates from closer to 1800, but he believes that the dynamics that gave rise to capitalism grew out of world trade beginning earlier in the 16th century. And in this respect, he's looking back to mercantilism and early colonialism and looking at the ways in which they made possible the emergence of this thing called capital. He suggests that commodity exchange gives rise to money. Money is useful because it facilitates the exchange of commodities. He says it is also the first form of appearance of capital. All new capital steps onto the stage, i.e. the market, in the shape of money, money which has to be transformed into capital by definite processes. Money in and of itself is not capital. Only money used in certain ways is capital. And in order to become capital, it actually has to go through a process of transformation. And he's going to attempt to understand that process of transformation and describe it for us, conceptualize it for us, in a way that will explain the dynamics of that process. He suggests that we should understand the commodity in terms of two factors or two dimensions, aspects, use value and exchange value. Normally he uses those two terms, use value, exchange value, use value, exchange value. I put exchange here in parentheses because in some respects, value for him is defined more closely along the exchange value axis or dimension, so to speak. He's actually going to offer a theory or a definition of value that differs from what we might generically think of as that which is valuable. And it has to do with the fact that both of these factors, both of these aspects, come together in commodity production under capitalism in a way that's new. So what is a use value? He says it's a thing which through its qualities satisfies human needs of whatever kind. The emphasis here is on qualities. It's a thing that has certain concrete, particular attributes that are useful to satisfy a human need. In other words, that has to do with the qualitative makeup of that good. And the fact is that those qualities make it different from other goods. Here we have 4 potential commodities: an apple, a pair of boots, a pair of rather crazy-looking sunglasses, and a bale of hay. Each of these 4 things can satisfy a concrete need, right? If you're a horse and you're hungry, that bale of hay or perhaps that apple are useful to you. They have value to you because you can eat them. If you're a human and you don't have a horse or a cow to feed, that bale of hay is of less use to you, right? It simply doesn't have the qualities that we would want for our own food, the way maybe the apple does. The apple is qualitatively different from the bale of hay. They're all different from each other. The pair of boots fulfills a concrete need for you, and that means it has a use value for you. So emphasis here is essentially on the qualitative difference of all of these goods. Those differences are what make each of these things useful, but only to particular people in particular circumstances. Now, does that sound pedestrian enough for you? Does that all make sense? Don't get too excited. All right, I'm not even getting a smile for this. All right, never mind. He says use values constitute the material content of wealth, whatever its social form may be. But in capitalist society, they are also the material bearers of exchange value. So use value is sort of universal, right? It exists in all societies. No matter what a given society thinks wealth is or how it embodies wealth, use values are still there as the material content of that wealth. However, in a capitalist society, they also simultaneously somehow carry exchange values, which are quantitative, not qualitative, expressions of relative worth, in which different objects are not different, but commensurable. They are abstractions from use value. So suddenly, you imagine a society in which if you have apples, more than you need, you can sell them and use them to buy a pair of sunglasses. Use that money that you get for those apples. You can turn that apple into sunglasses, or into hay, or into boots. All of these things are essentially somehow commensurable. And the reason that they're commensurable, or the thing that makes it possible for them to be commensurable, is the fact that they all have exchange value. As use values, commodities differ above all in quality, while as exchange values, they can only differ in quantity. The exchange value of this apple and the exchange value of those sunglasses, they may not be worth the same amount. They may have different prices, but the difference in the prices is purely quantitative. You could say it takes 2 apples to buy a pair of sunglasses. Or if they're really expensive sunglasses, it might take 200 apples to buy a pair of sunglasses, but the difference is purely quantitative. He says, therefore, exchange values, commodities, in the sense that they have exchange values, do not contain an atom of use value. That may sound odd, but he's suggesting that there are radical differences between these 2 faces of value. In one, they are non-commensurable, and they are valuable because of their particular concrete qualities. In the other, they are commensurable, and they differ only in quantity. Are there any questions? Is this like a totally bizarre philosophical argument? More or less? Let's see if we can make more sense of it. Think further about this. A thing can be a use value without being a value. And here he means value in that sense that I put parentheses around exchange. A thing can be useful to us, like air to breathe or water to drink, even though you don't buy and sell it. It doesn't have an exchange value. If it doesn't have an exchange value, it does not carry or bear value for capital. But it's still useful. A thing can be useful and also be a product of human labor without being a commodity. If you grow your own food and use it to feed yourself and your family and you don't sell it, that food is not a commodity. It has a use value, but it doesn't have an exchange value because it's not entering the market. In order to become a commodity, the product must be transferred to the other person for whom it serves as a use value through the medium of exchange. So you think about those coffee growers in Ethiopia making decisions about what kinds of things to grow. Some of what they're growing, they intend to sell into the market and make cash for. Some of what they're growing, they intend to sell locally rather than into international markets. Perhaps that's where they can do a better job. But some of what they decide to grow, they probably intend simply to use to feed themselves. And that's a decision actually between commodity production and non-commodity production. So what I asked you to read from Marx is his discussion of this transformation. How does money become capital? And why does this matter? He says there's a general formula for capital, which is this. You start with money, you turn it into commodities, then you sell them, and you end up with money again. But this little apostrophe is there to indicate M prime rather than M. The amount of money you end up with is supposed to be greater than the amount you started with, and that's what that little prime is intended to indicate. He suggests that there are contradictions in this general formula. Namely, how can the exchange of equivalents produce a surplus? How can you end up with more money at the end than you started with if at each stage you simply exchange equivalents? You exchange a certain number of apples for money, and the money is equivalent in value to the apples. You exchange, well, I'm sorry, I started at the wrong place. You start with money, you buy some apples. You use them to produce, say, apple juice, then you sell the apple juice. You sell it for what it's worth, you buy the apples for what it's worth, you buy everything else that you use to make the apple juice for what it's worth, and yet somehow at the end you've got more money than you started with. How can that happen? And Marx's answer is that one of the things you buy to produce the apple juice and turn the apples into apple juice is labor, labor power, and that labor power is a commodity that you can buy for its equivalent in money, but the use value you get from it will be greater than the exchange value you pay for it. And this for him is the origin of exploitation. This is his explanation for how value is produced. How you can have a system in which everything gets traded for its value, its equivalent value, and yet at the end you have more value than you started with, if at least you are the capitalist.